Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Today, you're going to hear from the creative team behind Ground Zero, Witchcraft in Connecticut, that is produced for the community of Woodbury, Connecticut.
Joining us are Linda Barr-Gale, Maribeth Cummings, Vail Barrett, and Loriann Witte.
They created something really special, a groundbreaking theatrical presentation for Glebe House Museum's 100th anniversary. This project has quite a history.
It all started with Linda's years-long portrayal of Moll Cramer, a woman accused of witchcraft and expelled from Woodbury.
And it's grown significantly over time. It evolved from popular cemetery tours to a one-woman show to a full theatrical production.
The performance brought together four historical figures: Moll Cramer, Thomas Allyn, Rebecca Greensmith, and Katherine Harrison.
Let's chat about this amazing effort. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. Today, we have special guests from the Woodbury Glebe House Ground Zero production, Witchcraft in Connecticut. Please introduce yourselves.
Vail Barrett from Bridgewater, Connecticut. This is the second event I've done with the Glebe House, and I found it very educational and a lot of fun.
Maribeth Cummings from Morris, Connecticut. I've been playing, Katherine Harrison, a woman accused of witchcraft in 1666 for 5 years now. Linda, I'm not sure, but yeah, in the Glebe House production.
Yep. Yeah. I'm Linda Gale. I've been playing Moll Cramer, the Witch of Woodbury, for about 13 years. And I have been writing the productions for Connecticut Witches and the Witch of Woodbury.
I'm Loriann Witte, and I am the director of the Glebe House Museum in Woodbury, Connecticut. I'm also from Woodbury, and I also portrayed Rebecca Greensmith, who was an accused witch, and she was also hanged for witchcraft.
Thank you all so much. What background do you want our audience to know about the Glebe House?
The Glebe House Museum and Gertrude Garden in Woodbury, Connecticut is a Revolutionary War historic house museum. Our interpretation time is 1771 to 1786, during the time of the American Revolution, although the house was built between 1740 and 1750. It's a Georgian colonial. It's very unique in its architecture. It's a salt box mixed with a gambrel style, which is very, very different in New England. We get a lot of architecture students who come to see our house. We do tours, we do educational programs, we have programs for adults and children, workshops, and we do a lot of special events like the Ground Zero that we just produced, as well as being known as the birthplace of the American Episcopal Church, or for, common knowledge, the Anglican Church, as it used to be called. And very important events happen there for the separation of church and state.
This is so wonderful. I'm so excited to have you guys here today. It's really important to us to be able to get into the communities and talk to those who are telling the stories of history. And you guys have put together something so special and so important. So thank you for that. Let's start with finding out a little bit about Moll Cramer. Who is Moll Cramer?
Moll Cramer was a woman who lived in Woodbury, Connecticut, approximately between 1750 and 1812. And she was married to the local blacksmith. And there's all kinds of stories and legends surrounding Moll, which were fascinating to me to first hear about her. And the stories that seem to continue from person to person are about Moll's affinity for horses. She used to race horses and was, I guess you would say, a horse whisperer. There was also, she had an affinity for certain plants, one of which was raspberries. wild raspberries used to always grow around wherever Moll lived, and they were enormous. And so I thought, boy, that's different. And she apparently there were a variety of stories. The original ones talk about a conflict that she had with her husband. Some say that he couldn't do his blacksmith work well because Moll used to disturb him. Every time she walked into the barn, the horseshoes would fly off the horses, and because they figured she was a witch. Another one was that her husband also raced horses, and he would lose to Moll. Therefore, he resented Moll. And all of these things dealing with iron and all of that, and that he felt that she was a witch because of her effect on iron and horseshoes and all of that. There also was an association between Moll and a local pig farmer, in that Moll was accused of killing him and all of his pigs. She went to his farm one day, and they had a heated discussion. He would not sell her any pork. She cursed him and left, and shortly thereafter, his pigs started dying, and then within a week, the farmer was also dead. And of course, that led to Moll being banished from Woodbury. But it's interesting how the story evolved. You hear a lot about her husband banishing her because of his dissatisfaction and the hindering of his work. But that doesn't really hold water when you look at it, because not only she was banished from her home, but her little son was also banished. And of course, there is a lot of guilt by association in Connecticut. You see that throughout the different witch stories. If you are a friend of, family of a accused witch, you can easily get that rubbed off on yourselves. Mary Staples, for example. I mean, there's so many which we bring out in the production. It seems like the town was very guilty about what they had done, that they had banished a woman and her son to the outskirts of Woodbury. And she became an extortionist. She was known to have fiery red hair, and she had a very bad temper. And she doesn't seem like the meek kind of character that some of them portray her as. She seems like a very bold, in-your-face kind of woman. And she did go back down to the town and extort money and food and supplies. And eventually she got enough to take her son and herself away. We think she went to New York State to get away so her son could have a normal life. He certainly couldn't have a normal life in Woodbury. And over time, I think the people of Woodbury were very embarrassed about what they had done. And so the story switched to her husband and threw her out. But as I said, that doesn't really hold water. She did put a curse on the town. Before she left, she said that Woodbury would get some of the worst thunder and lightning storms in Litchfield County. And some agree that the curse worked, because we get some whoppers here in Woodbury. So that is, in a nutshell, Moll Cramer. I've met her descendants, so I know she lived. Some people had a legend that she died, and her son died of exposure, but she did not, because her descendants have contacted me, and I've spoken with them. I've also visited her house where she lived with her husband, which he had inherited, and generations of his family had lived there. So you can see why he didn't leave with her. He had his business, he had a multi-generational household, and which still exists. I went through it, saw where she lived. It was really quite wonderful. Where she was banished to was the top of a hill. We live in the Litchfield Hills, so being on top of the hill is not a hard thing. But the road is called Tophet, and Tophet is from the Bible. It means hell or the devil. So they put her on Hell Road, and a very famous writer also lived. We have a lot of celebrities that live in the Woodbury area. And so she lived on the same road, eventually, decades later, as Arthur Miller, who wrote The Crucible.
Oh,
So
wow.
Moll and Arthur have something in common. They both lived on Tophet Road. So it's a fascinating story. I keep on trying to find out new things about Moll all the time.
Yeah.
That's it in a nutshell.
Great. Thank you. That's an amazing story. Some of the elements remind me of some other Connecticut witch trial stories and other New England stories, that it involves this extraordinary person by all accounts, and she might be a little quarrelsome, or people think that she's too upfront, that kind of story. When did tales of Moll Cramer first appear in writing?
I think in 1872, with the history of ancient Woodbury with William Cawthron. He wrote about her in that, and he had her husband threw her out kind of thing. But also the other little tidbits, the affinity for horses, which was really quite extraordinary. That was the first source that I went to, was Cawthron. The volunteers at the Glebe house are really quite extraordinary. And many of them have grown up with these stories. So I basically talked to as many of the volunteers as I could, particularly the ones who grew up here. I did not grow up here at all, so I didn't know any of this stuff. So everything was new to me. But they had a wealth of knowledge, and they were very critical, too, of Moll being meek and just going up and staying in her shack. No one's going to kick Moll out of anything. But the banishment was important because we saw Governor Winthrop Jr. He used banishment rather than hanging. The last witch was hanged in Connecticut was in 1663, and that was Mary Barnes of Farmington. After that, Winthrop's influence was the hallmark of the Connecticut witch scene, in that he got it. He took down spectral evidence. He also made it use banishment as the preferred form. If there was a conviction, he made it so the prosecutor had to prove that they were guilty. So you were presumed innocent in Connecticut, which made it very different from Massachusetts later on in the 1690s. So Connecticut started off badly, very badly, with 11 people killed within a 16-year period. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and Connecticut is very ashamed of that. And many of the records are missing for very good reasons.
Thank you so much. It's such a delight to get to talk about the Connecticut history today. And I really love it when these discussions spring out of art and events and storytelling. Loriann and Linda, how did events for Moll Cramer begin?
Like Linda said, she had been playing Moll Cramer. She's been playing that part for the past 13 years. So she's been playing it longer than I've been the director at the Glebe House. I've been the director this year for 9 years. And when I started, Linda had already been playing Moll Cramer in the cemetery because, like I said, which are upcoming, we do tours through our cemetery where we tell the stories of the real people of Woodbury and their history. And she was playing that part up in the cemetery. But her part became, Moll's story really resonates with people, and people loved hearing it. And as Linda's the amount of wealth of knowledge that she was gaining and all the research she was doing, as this part grows, it becomes, to me, too big to be in the cemetery, because cemetery parts, you can't stand there really for 20 minutes and talk because we've got to move the groups along. So I came up with this idea when I started, well, why don't we put Moll into, we have a cottage building that we use for our office. Why can't she have her own little standalone show inside of the cottage? And we'll set it up for seating, and we can have someone watch the door and let groups come in, and Moll can do her thing and talk to everyone. And then we'll just keep feeding people to her that way. And so her story can get longer. She can do a half an hour instead of just the little 10-minute blurb. And then that became so popular. And of course, we had COVID in there. So the concept for people that were all going to jam into this really small room in a cottage was not a good idea anymore. I started renting a tent for our backyard and putting Moll in the tent, and we would decorate the tent and have the typical, like, the things that people expect. We usually do as well, like having the bubbling cauldron with the dry ice in it and the lights and everything. And Linda came up with the idea of, well, instead of maybe people are tired of just hearing about Moll. Can we bring other witches, other Connecticut witches in and tell their stories? And then it grew from there. And then Maribeth came in, and we had several other people portraying parts. A few of them, one of them moved to Ireland. And as things go, everybody can't play that part every year. And then Vail joined. And being the director and being on site for a big event like our cemetery tour evenings, where we service, like there's like 400 to 500 people that come through in the night, I was never able to portray a witch like I always wanted to, because I have to be outside on site and available for everyone. But making it a separate event this year made it so that I could be part of it and actually portray someone. So I was very excited about that. And this year, like I said, it was totally different. We moved it to the Old Town Hall, which is a historic town building, had it on a stage, had it in a place where, instead of being in a tent where people were sort of, some years it was very uncomfortable for the actors, they can tell you, and for the people, whether some years it was very hot the end of October, some years it was freezing in the end of October. So having it in a theater setting made it more comfortable, but it also made it so that Linda could expand the history and we could tell more of everyone's story. And I just think that the way people will often ask, well, because of the way you're doing it, is this historically accurate? And I tell them, yeah, it's as historically accurate as we can get. But the way we choose to perform it, we find that people will retain things if you give it to them in an entertaining way. They remember the details rather than just sitting at a lecture where they're getting all this information sort of at them. It's a lot of dates and a lot of people. And if you hear their stories acted out, it helps bring the emotion to you and you really feel them as people.
So what can you tell us about the accused woman that you portrayed?
About Rebecca?
Yeah.
Rebecca. Miss Rebecca Greensmith. She was great to portray because basically she was a woman who did not follow her Puritan rules. She liked to drink and she liked to party. She was basically she liked to make things, alcoholic beverages other than beer, because, beer was a staple for everybody to drink. So that was acceptable, but making other alcoholic beverages and actually carousing and merrymaking, which was against the Puritan religion, and being out at night around a bonfire, running around sort of getting drunk with your friends was not exactly your regular Puritan fare there. And she was not apologetic to that, and she wasn't going to stop. And she was very in your face and kind of mouthy and was just, hey, this is, who I am. And in some ways, I think, though, also, especially to the end when she was accused and when her time, I'm sure, was coming before she was hung, I'm sure that, like any human being, I'm sure a lot of it, for me, seems like it would have been armor. It would have been a way to protect myself with I don't care, and I'll tell you who I make with. And so she ended up accusing, basically giving up all the people who were merrymakers with her. And she gave up her husband because he wasn't doing anything to clear her name, but wanted to make sure that she let him live. So she sort of took him down with her. But I think in the end result, she was still a person who had to have been afraid and scared about what was coming. And I'm sure she didn't want to die.
Yeah. Yeah. And Katherine Harrison, oh my goodness. That's like all three of these women were extraordinary. And I couldn't help but pick up on, you've got the horse affinity with Moll, and Katherine, her bees listened to her and her cattle came too easily for the people to be comfortable. But I'm not going to talk about Katherine. Mary Elizabeth, I want you to tell us about Katherine for you.
Well, Katherine, there's probably the most evidence of her case because it was so well documented. She wrote so much about her accusations, and it's just a well documented case, which is great. It was also a little challenging, I guess, to start by saying that she's the reason why, thanks to Winthrop, it became harder to convict someone of spectral evidence because two or more people had to witness the same event. And so that was a good thing. But playing her, there was something, and I think it was in Cynthia Boyden's book where it said that talking about the cattle, the call was Hokanum. And it was and I went, what does that mean? And it's a river. And I'm like, she's just using a different phrase to call her animals. I live on a horse farm, so I know when you call your animals. And she just used something different that nobody used. And so people were saying, that's weird. I could see the Puritans looking for stuff with her, looking for ways to accuse her. And so I kind of played into that when I started doing the part, using that call and really calling it out in the production. That was fun. But I think all of these women had to be a bit saucy, independent in their spirit, and willing to go up against the norms. And I admire that in them a lot. And even if it could mean a death sentence, but they were spunky and saucy and spicy. And yeah, I think. And the reason she really didn't face there was the accusation of being a fortune teller when she was starting through Rebecca. But I think it mainly happened after her husband died and she was alone and she didn't want to remarry and she didn't have any male heirs. So they knew that they could get her property if they could get in her estate and everything, her business, if they could accuse her of something. And her first court documents I did read when she started going to court was for her daughters. Her husband left her with the estate, but he left, I forget, like maybe £1,000 to each of her daughters. And she didn't want that. She wanted more to go to her daughters. And she tried to fix that. And so that's where the court documents started with her. It's interesting. So that kind of drew a light to her, I think, as well. But she's a great character. She's really fun to play. I like playing her spunky and very confident in who she was type of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. She's a great character. And she was so fortunate that John Winthrop Jr. was in place at the time and that he had good friends like Gershom Bulkley, a minister, to help him sort these things out. But she gets banished and they try to run her out of the town where she goes banished to.
I traced her to New York and to Stamford, Connecticut, but was part of Westchester. And there was her daughter, I think it's in the Bronx. I have to do a little more research there, is mentioned. She married someone in the Episcopal Church there. Yeah. So it's interesting. But she did get in more trouble over there too. Because she's outspoken. She saw something she didn't feel was fair and with what's happening. She was an entrepreneur and she knew how to make money and take care of herself. So I found that interesting.
And Linda, you brought these two other accused witches into Moll's story. I know there wasn't like a huge selection, but how did you pick them? And also, I guess I want to know, and Vail, I want to hear about Allyn very much so too. But since we're right in the mix on these ladies, Gail, what was it like, your creative vision? How did it come out with these ladies?
Well,
together?
I wanted to concentrate on the 16 years where we had hangings. But I also had to bring in the John Winthrop Jr. piece and the Gershom buckler, and also make a contrast in 1692 between the witch panic in Stamford, Connecticut, as opposed to Salem, Massachusetts, because the differences are stark. And so there's a lot of stuff. I picked Rebecca because Rebecca was the linchpin in the Hartford witch panic. And she brought in, she not only talked about herself, Rebecca, but she talked about the others, how they were involved, how they got accused, which was Ann Cole, whose visions were validated by Increase Mather. And which is really quite important when you look at the whole story, because Increase Mather validated Ann Cole, and all of the people that she came up with in her visions were accused. Now that was reinforced by Rebecca, but nevertheless, Increase Mather was instrumental. He was also instrumental in the Salem witch trials, because the sly old fox, when he started seeing things go south with Salem, he turned around and instead of endorsing spectral evidence and all the things that he had endorsed with the Hartford witch panic, Increase did the case of conscience and said, maybe we shouldn't quite listen to spectral evidence. You know, the devil is controlling that. What a fox. He's one of my favorites. But Katherine doesn't just cover Katherine. Katherine also talks about Elizabeth Godman. She also talks about Goody Garlick from East Hampton. She also talks about the Flying Witch of Hartford, which is Elizabeth Seeger. And Katherine does a wonderful job explaining their stories and what was said about them. So through these three characters, and then with Vail, with the Thomas Allyn, so I've got a convicted witch, which is Rebecca. I've got an accused witch that gets away. And what Thomas does is cover 7 of the people who were hanged in a very short period of time, from 1647 to 1654. And he was in Windsor at that time. Thomas Allyn is the one who accused Lydia Gilbert. And so I wanted to get an accuser's perspective. What did he go through? What hell did that man go through to have the crazy ideas that he had in his head? And Vail does a wonderful job of that. And so that's how, through these 3 characters, is how I get everybody involved. And then I try to fill in the gaps. But I think in future, I want them to tell even more about the history, because I could just never get over the fact that in the 13 original colonies, all of the hangings were in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And it's like, is there something in the water? There very well could be, but there were witch accusations, people who were convicted, but on a very small scale. But I wanted to bring in the history of what was going on. Why did these people come to Massachusetts? The Great Migration. What was going on in England? Because these people were connected. So I had to bring in, of course, James I, Charles I, Charles II and James II, because that was the reason we had all the problems, was what they were doing with the charters and the witch propaganda that happened during the English Civil War. So all of this is woven together in these stories, and it's a lot to try to get us through at a little community production. But we did it.
Sounds amazing. And Vail, I'd love to hear about Thomas Allyn and what part he plays in this.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm the guy that really feels that the colonies are overwhelmed by evil. And I'm a true believer in all the terrors and pitfalls that witchcraft has happened to the communities. The idea of getting into trouble was so easy in some ways. One, if you were a woman and needed to make a potion and maybe help your family with health issues, you would deal with the Native Americans because some of the English plants didn't translate to New England. So connecting with that was looked upon as dealing with witches and or evil. Also, if you were exchanging guns with the French or others, that again was looked at. You're working with Satan. So those two things were very easy to get in trouble with. One that got me the most was when I was they all know this, but when I was in the militia, I was standing there normally and my gun fell out of my hands. It went off and killed poor Henry Stiles. Everybody saw it. It just seemed rather normal, but things changed after 3 years. I was fined. I was given probation and accidental murder charges. And yet 3 years later, it was discovered that Henry Stiles' housekeeper had cursed him the day before he went off to that militia event. And then it all came together, and I went right along with this. Of course she cursed my gun. Of course she's guilty of this, hating her master, in a sense, at his house. And I'm perfectly fine with this. And so are a lot of other people that actually trial, conviction, hanging after all that time. And again, eyewitnesses that were there just thought it was an accident. As Linda said, I condemn many of the witchcraft acts. I feel they're penetrating the community and we're out of control in many ways. And so I'm rather convincing and getting angry at Moll. And it turns out that she's, a witch, so to speak, that I'm talking to all along. And I'm real shocked that I've kind of exposed my hatred to her when she is sympathetic and compassionate towards witches. But it seemed to work out, and meaning my character, as Linda said, I kind of got into it and I enjoyed it. And it's a wonderful piece of history that Lori and Linda and Mary Elizabeth we've all kind of put this together that made that part of Connecticut history very vivid through this production, which I thought was wonderful. So that helps a little bit. Any questions for me as far as Thomas Allyn at all? But I'm the male guy that comes in and stirs the pot quite a bit. But it's all very, very real history. Extraordinary. Okay. There was many more people I accused of, and I was quite a difficult guy. But the part itself was a lot of fun because you could take it to different levels and then show the fear, validated often fear of what the climate was, epidemics, wild animals, Indians. That community there, especially in Windsor, far western Connecticut, was highly dangerous and scary to live in at that time. So it was a matter of survival, panic, no leadership when Winthrop was away. So there was quite a lot going on that fed on itself. And I believed it. Well, I think we all sort of set the mood of what that era was like. And I'm glad it came together with a big effort, but definitely the community seemed to enjoy it, which was great. That's the whole idea, to educate the community and express the good, bad, and ugly of what happens in our states sometimes.
Thanks so much, Vail.
Sure.
Linda, is there anything else about the way this story, the structure, and the message to the community that you want to make sure that we know? You've done such a great, all of you today have done such a great job of reminding us of the complexities of the Connecticut history. It's such a wonderful history, even though it has these sad stories in it. But I would love to hear anything else you want us to know about the community receiving this story and the messaging that you wanted them to get.
The Puritans, the way they went after their own, the fear. Why was there so much fear? And it was because of the way Connecticut and Massachusetts were founded and the people who founded it. They didn't come for religious tolerance at all. They came for complete and utter conformity. And if you didn't conform, you were banished. And that's why they came over. I mean, they're very different from the Pilgrims of 1620 who are isolationists. These were people who were very connected to England. These were English yeomen. So this is a solid middle class of people. And I think people wonder, well, why did all of the witchcraft stuff start in the Connecticut River Valley? When you see the difference between the harshness of the Connecticut River Valley, which was called the wilderness, and you compare that to the Mass Bay seashore, there is quite a big difference. They were also neglected as a colony. There was so much going on in England. You know, the reason they came over was because of King Charles I dissolved Parliament. And they thought that England was going to be the end of days. It was doomed. So they were going to start their colony in Massachusetts, the second coming of Christ. So these are really dedicated people. And when you have that kind of conformity, you're going to have problems. And then when you start using witch propaganda, which they did in the Civil War, it's a powder keg. And that powder keg went off in Windsor, Connecticut. And it was palpable. So it's a call for religious freedom, being able to speak your mind, be able to express yourself. And it's a testament to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the hallmarks of what the fundamental orders were actually all about, which is what they were spearheading. The irony is that the fundamental orders was the beginning of democracy, and yet they were anything but democratic, and so many of at least the ministers were not democratic. So, yeah, it's hailing democracy, it's hailing freedom, it's hailing religious freedom.
I sort of like the part of the ending where we all pay tribute to the lives of the witches, long overdue, of course, but it's rather solemn, it's meaningful, and it puts a human face on them, frankly, that everybody needs to realize these are women. These are terrified of what their neighbors are thinking, and the mood is, no pun intended, wicked. And I mentioned with Loriann at the end, she's scared. She didn't want to die. So she's very human to the audience as this progresses. And I thought that was very important. And the tribute at the end is very, very well, nicely done.
We have the ring of the bells for whom the bell tolls. And we toll for each of the 11 victims in Connecticut. And of course, I got that idea. I'm from New York City. I was down at 9/11, and that's what was done for the people who died at 9/11. And so we have our own bell ringing for the 11 victims in Connecticut.
And not just women, men too.
Oh, yeah.
Nathaniel was one of the people who was hung.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 2 men.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely good to remember.
Mhm.
And John and Joan Carrington.
It's so important to remember that there were people who were just like us. They weren't some kind of strange, cave people or something weird. We think of them as being so rustic and not as sophisticated as we were, but they had the exact same emotions and feelings and attitudes that we have, and the same foibles and mistakes were made, definitely. So it's important to realize they're all human beings, and this was just a colossal injustice done by human beings to other humans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very.
I think many of the witches, the cunning women, the white witches of thousands and thousands of years, were people who had psychic abilities, telepathic abilities, healing abilities. These were people who had extraordinary gifts that were used by the community and cherished by the community. And that started to be threatened with the Malleus Maleficarum in the 1480s, and also by King James I, who started, because Elizabeth had a witch in her administration. Elizabeth I, she had John Dee, who was her own personal Merlin, who invented the conjuring language for witches, which is the Enochian language. So clearly there was a shift in how people started viewing cunning women. Having a white witch in your village was the best thing you could have. As we say in the production, it's like having AI, ADT, and a Ring doorbell all in one if you had your own white witch. Of course, that concept was, during the Civil War, was taboo. You had to get rid of all the witches, good and bad.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that any of you would like to share today before we close out?
The idea of promoting this education, the awareness of history. I always think that's fascinating. I'm a bit of a history buff, Civil War mostly, but this era really came to life for me. And I would love to expand the history of various good, bad, and different periods in American history. We're quite a mix, I must say. But it is enlightening and very important to see this things that went wrong and remedied to a degree, or recognized that we are still a civilized people that has compassion. How many 300 years later? And that's important to me as far as growth and human understanding. Any thought?
I do. I think it's important to recount, like Val said, moments in history, because we have a terrible way of repeating things in history. And I think it's important, the more we expose different events that happen, and people can be like, huh, that's interesting. I see, and maybe there's less of a chance of it repeating itself the more we expose it. That's all I'm going to say.
I think that's a very important point. We had, I was amazed that we had so many young people come to our event. And I was really happy about that, because I don't think they get enough of history in school anymore. And a lot of that has to do with testing, what the school districts, what as a country we think it's sciences. We're behind apparently on sciences and math, and it's more important for them to have all of the time to get these things in. But they're losing out on learning about where we all came from and the stories that came before them. And like Maribeth said, if you don't know where you've come from, then you're doomed to repeat the mistakes over and over again, because no one's teaching you what the mistakes were. And I think people think that there's this concept that, oh, well, we'll never do stuff like that again. But I don't know. I think that you see the way the world's going now, I think that we're really close to that. Again, we're just forgetting the things that happened in the past, and we're not teaching anybody that. And there are some really good things we've done in the past, and there's some really terrible things that we've done in the past. But all of that needs to be understood by everyone. And I think we're losing that. So I was glad those young people were there, and they were so interested in the subject. And they said they didn't realize that any of this happened. And I think that's one of the reasons why, especially for our organization and for the Glebe House, that's one of the ways I like to talk about history, is making sure the stories are coming alive for people, because that's how I feel like it's easier for them to absorb it and learn it, because how many times can people go through the lines of a movie that they love and tell you every line in the movie? And if you give them the story that way, you have a shot that they're going to remember it. And they're going to remember a lot from what we gave them. And I think that's really important. So I'm happy that we presented this. I can't wait to do it again.
The thing that just sticks out to me was the difference between Increase and Cotton Rather and John Winthrop Jr. All three were extraordinary men, extraordinary minds, and well-educated. But when you look at the difference between the beehive mindset of the Mathers compared to the flexible mind of Winthrop Jr., not his father, but Winthrop Jr., and you see how brilliant he really is. And he does not have a beehive mind. He has a flexible mind. And he can look at all different angles of the same thing and come up with win-win solutions instead of Increase Mathers, win-lose solutions. To me, that is the lesson of all of this. The favorite thing that I've had with all the productions was when Moll's descendants came up and gave me a big hug after my performance. That I liked a lot.
I have one quick story, very quick. The Crucible was mentioned, Arthur Miller, and the panic in that book. I went to a lecture about the blacklisting McCarthy era in New York City, and they spoke about it, and that's what it relates to this kind of behavior, panic behavior. So it was a good lecture. Everybody was about to leave, and then they said, any more questions? And this person got up and said, that man ruined my life. And I could just see any of these witches in the middle of a town square if this happened to them and said, you villagers ruined my life. And that brought it home for me as a very personal thing to happen to any of them or all of them. Anyway, it was a good lecture.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Did you have something to add, Loriann?
Yeah, I was just going to add something interesting that I did yesterday. I actually watched the movie The Witch again. And watching it really last night, just going through it, really made it real. I watched a program where the director talked about that he wanted people to take it literally because he's telling it as a folktale, although he had actual information and diaries and things that he was going off of. But what's real to me is when you look at just the concepts through it of the father and the mother and their fear and how afraid they are of all these different concepts and how real that they believe all these things to be, how real they believe that there are entities out there in the woods that are out to get them and that they can't break that threshold, and that if they do, something bad's going to happen, and how real they believe that the devil's going to use animals to talk to them and to turn their mind, and just how afraid they were of everything they didn't understand in the natural world just came down to it being the devil. And that was it. And I can't even imagine living with that type of mindset and fear that everything that is unknown is evil.
We really love to bring local and community discussions to our podcasts. Thank you, Connecticut, for telling the stories of your witch hunts. Be sure to check out the Glebe House.
Visit glebehousemuseum.org for more information on the museum and on events. And have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.